Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I am actually fulfilling the other parts of the show's mission, which everyone forgets, including myself, to actually do, which is to cover non-political or quasi-political topics. This may overlap with politics, but that's not how we're primarily approaching it. Today we're talking about Ohio poetry. Specifically the poet D.A. Levy, who was a favorite of both Alexander and myself. I think a massively underread poet. I remember finding a lot of his books randomly at a shop. A shop where I bought some books that Gary Snyder and Rex Roth actually had some of their collection like left at. So there's a D.A. Levy collection there, which I believe was actually like in someone else's collection, another poet's collection. So, but we're also talking about something completely seemingly unrelated, although Alex has recently written an essay for Periodicities, a journal of poetry and poetics, on this topic, which is Rainer Maria Rilke, Paul Celan, and the general influence of German poetry on people like D.A. Levy and a lot of, say, second half of the 20th century poetry. And we were just talking off air about how we were introduced to this. I love German poetry. When I was studying poetry way back 20 years ago, I had to take a translation class, and I picked the two languages I kind of know, which by that I mean I can read fluently but speak terribly. And that was German and Spanish. And so I got really into translated Rilke. And in fact, when I was in high school, I think it was my junior year of high school, I was in a bookstore, and for like $3, because it was highly discounted, and this was also in the before times when books were way the hell cheaper, I bought the Stephen Mitchell translations of Rilke and became obsessed with them. And between that and Nietzsche and Hegel is why I even bothered to learn German at all. So
not a bad reason.
Yeah, mostly philosophy, but it was some poetry. And I really love German poetry. I know we don't talk about it a ton on the channel, but I'm a big Goethe fan. I like Hölderlin. But I also like modern German poetry, including like even super reactionary poetry like Gottlieb Bean. But I also like Paul Celan and of course Rilke. I think everybody's supposed to like Rilke, but except when John Berryman called him a fascist in that one Dream song.
And it's more than just Berryman, actually, although I left that out of the article, but it's something I hope to tackle in some further writing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I think when people talk about German poetry, they don't talk a lot about the 20th century, even though everyone reads Rilke. And I do think most professional poets do get exposed to Rilke. Maybe they get exposed to Trakl, and most of them know Paul Celan. But right. There's a big reason why a lot of people don't go to the other German poets in the early part of the 20th century, and I wonder why that is. But no, I don't. But to get to the point of your article and let you talk for a little while, what the hell does D.A. Levy have to do with Rilke and Celan?
Well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't make such a direct connection as you did in the introduction to say that Levy was influenced by Rilke or Celan or by German poetry in general. Though he certainly did read German poetry in translation. He did take German for a few years in high school, as I know doing my biographical research. but I don't have any direct connections with him to Rilke or Celan or other German poets. I'd say mainly looking at international literature, he read a lot of French poetry. René Char comes up a few times in some of his prose writing. But the most direct connection that can be made between Levy and Rilke is actually something that a friend of his made a connection in this anthology that his friends put together in support to raise funds for one of his trials. I believe it was the obscenity trial. His friends, RJS and TL Chris, put together this anthology called the You Can Have Your Fucking City Back anthology, after a phrase that he said during a reading where a friend of his said that he was a leader of the literary scene here in Cleveland. Anyways, a friend of his made a connection with him and Rilke based on a line from Rilke saying that who can speak of living? Endurance is all. And that's how I prefer to translate that line. I can't quite remember the original German, but sometimes it's translated as who can speak of living, to survive is all. I prefer to endure. But the connection that I'm making between Levy and Celan and Rilke in this article is purely through their writing. So it's, there could be some connection that Levy made himself through his reading, but really I'm just searching through the writing and outlining some connections that I found myself through reading each of them deeply.
So for our audience, we're going to break this down because I'm going to assume when I talk about poetry, my audience doesn't know shit, which I normally don't assume, but today we're going to have to. Who is D.A. Levy? Who is Rainer Maria Rilke? And who was Paul Celan? Let's just start with the very, very basics before we go deep.
Sure, of course. Well, Levy was a Cleveland poet and publisher. I like to emphasize that latter part, him being a publisher. He was born in 1942 here in Cleveland. He started publishing poetry in the late 60s under Renegade Press and Seven Flowers Press and a few other press names. He had a lot of different press names. I'm currently writing a biography on him, and I'll be holding a screening here in Cleveland actually later this April about a documentary film on him called If I Scratch, If I Write by the filmmaker Con Petrochuk. Levy has a very difficult biography. I'd highly recommend anyone to look into my thesis that I wrote on him a couple years ago. But I think we'll just be brief here, so I'll just leave it at that. Rilke was all three of these are poets, obviously. Rilke actually did do a little bit of publishing of his own, although it was a very, very short-lived project. But he's mostly known here in the U.S. for his Elegies, while in Germany, he's known for this actually ballad. I can't quite remember its name, but it's a war ballad, which I found really interesting doing my research for this essay, that in Germany he's known for an entire other book other than the Elegies, which he's primarily known here in the US for. Now, Celan, and here's a point between Celan and Rilke. So Rilke was born in Prague, and he eventually came to live in France for a majority of his life, although he later lived in Switzerland. And Celan was Romanian, I believe. I could be wrong on that. And, in this period of the late 1800s, nationalities, changed around quite a bit as territories changed during some wars in the period. But Celan also came to live in France, just like Rilke. And there's a line in my essay about how Rilke they're both German-speaking authors, Celan and Rilke, but they're very interlinguistic. They bring a lot of languages to their poetry, especially Celan, which makes translation of him especially difficult. Which is why I give props to Pierre Jaurès for his translations of him. You titled this episode, I noticed, Derick, with Celan at the beginning, and I find that really interesting because when I was starting this essay, I only approached Celan as a kind of entry point for talking about Rilke and Levy, but he became much more of a focus as I continued to write the essay.
Yeah, Celan fascinates me. You're right; he was born in Romania, although the city he was born in Romania is no longer in Romania; it is now in the Ukraine.
Okay.
And yeah, he was part of that Sudetenland German language speaking group, although he was Jewish too.
Yes.
And he is one of the poets approved by leftists to like, which is kind of funny. Because there's not a whole lot of easily read poets from this time period whose politics make most leftists happy. But Celan actually was a socialist and, sided with the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War and, has good credentials there. I'm not actually interested in his politics today. I also find it interesting. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know that at all, actually, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. The Duino Elegies are the Duino Elegies. Baroque is where I started. Like I think most people, it was that and the sonnets for Orpheus. Although I think more people in English probably actually read his letters to a young poet, which is not even poetry.
Yes, those are, I think, the most republished of his works here. And I believe, like we were talking before the show was aired, we both came to Rilke through Stephen Mitchell's translations, that vintage edition. And, I immediately gravitated also towards the Elegies. The Elegies, besides the letters to the poet, which I believe, the letters to the poet, letters to a young poet, are probably the most circulated of Rilke's materials in English. But you won't find nearly as many translations of that book as you will the Duino Elegies. There's a certain fascination with the Duino Elegies and their constant need to be retranslated into English. And so that was what preoccupied me with the Elegies, because when I first started translating Rilke, I was actually interested in a somewhat, I wouldn't say unrecognized poem of his, but one that doesn't garner nearly as much attention as the Elegies or Letters to a Young Poet or the Sonnets to Orpheus, which are a project closely allied with the Elegies. But one thing I hope to accomplish with this essay was to see the significance of this earlier long poem, Requiem for eine Freundin, Requiem for a friend, a woman friend, that is, which was a poem he wrote for his friend and former lover, Paula Becker. That is Paula Modersohn Becker, as she was married. And Rilke would later marry a friend of hers that he both met them in the town of Worpswede in Germany. They were both painters. Actually, Rilke's later wife, Clara Westhoff, was a student of Auguste Rodin, and later Rilke would become Rodin's secretary in France, in Paris. And this is the period of time where he wrote his poem Requiem for eine Freundin, for Paula after she passed away. And in the essay here, I'm trying to establish the significance of his relationship with Paula and this poem's importance for Rilke's later work, like the Elegies and the Sonnets to Orpheus, because I think that hasn't been discussed in English scholarship, although it has been approached in some German scholarship.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was aware of the poem because I've read a ton of Rilke, but I've never really considered it all that important, which is probably not super smart of me. There is a translation that I have found by Stephen Mitchell that was published in 1981 in the Paris Review. So I'll just read that, and then if you want to read the German, you can if you like. I don't know, I don't know if my audience cares one way or the other, but and I don't love the Mitchell translation of this poem. Actually,
I could just read you because I translated this and I actually had it published earlier this year by the same editor who runs Periodicities, Rob McLennan. If you'd like, I could just, it's quite a long poem, so I wouldn't expect we could get all the way through it. I could just read you the opening.
Read me some critical selections from it, because like I could read the entire poem, but I do think a lot of people will probably start to lose.
Yeah, that could take at least 10 minutes. It's quite a long poem. Let's see if I can find it very quickly here.
And what collection was this in originally?
So actually, it was published alone.
Just as a singular poem.
It was paired with another Requiem for, I believe, a soldier, a poet who died at war. Count Calcrath, I believe, but I could be mistaken. Actually, let's see here. Might just have to get my copy of the book, but I do have one handy.
Yeah.
One moment. Here it is.
Okay.
So this is the first stanza, and I think this will do enough. This is from Requiem for eine Freundin. I carry the dead, and I let them go, and was surprised to see them so confident, so soon at home in death, so satisfied, so unlike their reputation. Only you turn back, you brush me, you skirt by, you want to bump against something so that it sounds of yourself and betrays you. Oh, don't take from me what I am slowly learning. I am sure you wander when you are moved toward any one thing out of homesickness. We transform this from within our being as soon as we recognize it. And so in my essay here.
Okay, so go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
No, I was about to let's get to the essay, but I really like your translation. I'm going to read two others so that people get a feel for how variant this can go.
Yes.
This is the standard version by Stephen Mitchell, which I don't like. And I'll just read the same thing. I have my dead, and I have let them go, and was amazed to see them so contented, so soon at home and being dead, so cheerful, so unlike their reputation. Only you return, brush past me, loiter, try to knock against something, so that the sound reveals your presence. Oh, don't take from me that I am slowly learning. I'm sure you have gone astray if you moved to homesickness for something in this dimension. We transform these things. They aren't real. They are only the reflections upon the polished surface of our being. Now, the polished surface of our being, of course, reminds me of John Ashbery, but you're translate, and I'm not just saying this to flatter you because I have no problem pissing off guests. But your translation reads a lot better. And one of the things that used to frustrate me about Mitchell is I could see something in RIlke reading Mitchell, but I would often be like, why are there so many small words in the English translation that aren't in the German? Like,
right, because you have a grasp of German, and
right.
and you can, you're reading the bilingual edition, and you can see these small discrepancies, which isn't to say that Mitchell's translations are inaccurate, because that is a point that I would disagree with in the theory of translation, along with Pierre Jaurès and Johannes Göransson. But we don't have to get too deeply into the theories of translation. I push folks towards the essay for some of that minutia. But yeah, you said you had one more, I believe.
I have one more. This is by James Rasmussen. It's the same stanza. I have dead ones and I let them go, and I was astonished to see them so comforted. So quickly at home and being dead, so at ease, so different from their reputation. You alone, you come back. You brush against me, you move around, you want to bump against something so it makes a sound and discloses you. Oh, do not take from me, I slowly come to know. I am right, you err when you moved, have homesickness for anything. Retransfigure it. It is not here. We reflect it out from within our being as soon as we recognize it. Which again, thinking about the German here, these are both not wrong, but they have different. If I was being like super critical, they have different problems. And to go to your essay, and towards the end, we'll talk about Pierre Jaurès. I met him once in New Orleans. Yeah, he's a fascinating guy. But I think you do a whole lot with this poem. So to go back to your essay, like, why do you find this poem so enlightening, particularly when compared to Levy? Because I will say this, if you've ever read D.A. Levy, he doesn't remind you of RIlke. He reminds, I do see the similarities. Reading your essay, I was like, whoa. But, when you read D.A. Levy, you're more immediately to think of, oh, he's like some weird lost beat that got dropped in Cleveland somehow or something, which is not really fair, but that's most people's frame of reference.
Absolutely. It is. So I believe, so one of your questions there is about the connection between RIlke and Levy. Mm-hmm. And the first one was, can you remind me? I'm sorry.
It's just how do you get from this poem? Like, what does this poem illustrate to you about the relation to Levy?
Right. Okay. Well, I'll start with what the potential significance of Requiem for eine Freundin for some of Rilke's later work, and then try to connect from there to Levy. So I think Requiem for eine Freundin really is where I was able to see how Rilke was able to move from his earlier work towards the Elegies, the sonnets to Orpheus, and back into the Elegies. And just recently, I was forwarded some translations from the North Carolina professor David Mead of some of Rilke's French poetry, actually, his poems on roses, which I really wished I could have had before I wrote my essay. But anyways, so this Requiem, I think, is where Rilke crystallizes his style and approach to poetry for the Elegies. And in my essay, I get into the details of that, but I think it has to do with speaking. The poem being addressed to a particular person, I think, is really significant in the Requiem and for the Elegies as well, because oftentimes scholarship will look at the Elegies as an address to Rilke's former lover, Lou Andreas Salome, who people might be interested to know was just a stunning writer of her own. And she was also proposed to by Nietzsche, of all people. and
But to say, kind of famously rebuffed Nietzsche.
Yes, and may have led to his death in some ways. Although I'm not quite so clear on that, but I'd like to propagate that myth in any case. Some myths are just too good to resist. But anyways, so I'm looking at the Requiem as where Rilke cements his approach to poetry as an address to a person in particular. The Elegies were an address to Lou and stem out of him being at the Duino castle. Although the Elegies are dedicated to Princess Mary von Taxenhoele, are not necessarily dedicated, but are the property of her, because that is how he actually dedicates them to her. So the Elegies are really this address to a constellation of people in Rilke's life. And I think he's first able to accomplish that in his Requiem. And so now moving on to this very kind of tenuous connection, but once you kind of first connect that first little spindly thread, I'm able to make, what I think, and what I think you read in the essay was somehow a substantive connection to Levy between Rilke and Celan as well. And I find that in their mode of address to readers, but also in their use of not necessarily symbols, because that's something I dispute, but their use of mythology also, and how they're able to address readers with mythological language. And primarily that comes through the figure of the angel, which is an extremely deep topic of Rilke scholarship, and one that I hope to kind of correct in this essay. But I have absolutely no illusions that this essay is going to somehow, impact scholarship anyway, because it's published in an online journal and not in any kind of academic forum. But purely just as a personal interest of mine, because I also am hoping to translate Rilke's Duino Elegies as a book-length project at some point, and I'm close to accomplishing that with the first few months of this year. But perhaps now we can get into, what the connection between Levy is, what the connection between Levy, Celan, and Rilke is with their use of mythology. I was really curious to know, Derick, what you thought of, which I mean, really honestly takes up quite a bit of the essay, is my treatment of the angels, because I do think when anyone brings up angels or mythological creatures and talks about them at length, you got to wonder, what is this? Is this person crazy? A little bit.
Yeah, I find it. I was actually the kind of semi-religious references in Rilke actually do fascinate me, and the angels are obviously a point of contention, because I mean, just to bring up the most famous reference of the angels in English isn't from Rilke himself, and I actually alluded to it earlier. The angels are called fascist by John Berryman in one of the Dream songs. So
Really?
it's specifically jackbooted angels, I think, is the phrase that Berryman uses.
I'm gonna retort with the title of a Lenore Candle book. They slaughtered the angels first, I believe.
Right. And I think that the elegies are I agree with you. They're far more commonly read in English, but they also baffle people because you have this strong interweaving of mythology with. I agree with you. They're not really symbols. It's more emblematic than that. There these things that are used to invoke things, but not in a symbolic one-to-one way. And then you have to figure out the the mythological reference too. And Levy also has angels. I mean, Levy also does that thing that gets him associated with the beats, where there's all kinds of Buddhist references as well. So
and he
dealing with,
and we're both practicing Buddhists.
Yeah.
In my understanding, I'm a Pure Lander.
Yeah, I'm a former Theravadan, and I'm now also a Shin Buddhist, although in the Bright Dawn school. So I guess I am also a Pure Lander. But I love me some Buddhist poets from this time period, partly because they get so much wrong. But
yes. And that's going to be a difficult chapter in my biography with Levy, because just reading him on a surface level, especially out of the context of some of his larger books, it can be easy to associate him with a lot of the figures of the time, whether that be Ginsberg in particular, or Kerouac, or otherwise.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think this actually does for me is the way that they use mythology, they being both RIlke and Levy, and reading your article. And yes, listeners, I would strongly suggest you read it, and it will be linked in the show notes so that you can follow what the hell we're talking about. Is this way in which Buddhist mythology is invoked in Levy, and I compare it to Gary Snyder, because Gary Snyder is one of the beat poets that actually eventually learned actual things about Buddhism.
Yeah, that is a very good comparison. Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah. Whereas when you read Jack Kerouac, and to a lesser degree when you read Ginsberg, even though they're the more famous Buddhists, like, in their poetry and in their prose, you get the feeling that they don't always understand Buddhism, and it's that well at all. And it's hard to get what they are getting from it. I mean, even if you read Dharma Bums, you almost like think this guy's, that's Jack Kerouac, by the way, for people who don't know this literature. But by the end of it, because I reread it actually did a reading group with a bunch of Buddhists on it, and we were at the end of it, we're like, I think this guy's Catholic.
He is. And actually, that is a direct biographical statement he made later in his life. A lot of the most popular books, whether it be from Kerouac or Ginsberg, are from earlier in their careers. With Ginsberg, it's Howl, Kaddish, and so later in his life, Ginsberg sobered up quite a bit and became more of a serious practitioner. I believe there was one song in particular that he even donated to at the end of his life when he passed away. But yeah, Snyder, I think, is more of a concrete comparison to make with Levy in terms of his religious practice. But of course, with Ginsberg, with Celan, and with Levy, they all come out of a Jewish background also.
Right.
And that's significant for Levy's treatment of angels, because he primarily discusses in his work, in specific, the Hebrew angel of death. And Rilke's invocation, and I really like that term that you're using, because I would agree that although a lot of scholars treat the angels as a symbol, I think they're, we don't have to speculate here. We can just look into his biography, which isn't to reduce, the poems to his intention, but just to say that he has elaborated a theory, of his poetry, and we can look to that in his own biographical writings. Although the angels in Rilke's writings are more opaque and obscurely referential, he did directly connect them to Islamic angels, and originating in Sufi mythological creatures, and he especially outlines a theory of poetics where the perspective of the speaker, of the writer, is within the angel. And that's, really where communication for us and with anyone participating, in this discussion or listening in could break down, because it can be very difficult to contextualize, a statement like that. The poem or the address is taking place within the angel. What does that mean? But really, I think, what I'm trying to, accomplish here, and I believe, this is what I conclude with in the essay, and really cut to the chase, is to say that, Levy and RIlke, and I don't believe this for Celan actually, is that they're making a direct address to readers. And I think they are addressing readers as an angelic audience, which really what I mean to say with that is that RIlke and Levy, they both believe in the potential completeness of humanity. And RIlke also had an interest in Buddhism. I wouldn't say it was nearly to the same degree as either Snyder or Levy, or perhaps yourself or myself, Derick. But he does have quite, a few poems. I believe it comes up in, maybe you can remember this, his new poems, where I believe one is addressed, one is titled The Buddha in Glory. And there's another one, but it ends, I think, one of his collections there. It's either New Poems 1 or 2. So he was also interested, in the Buddha. But I'm not quite sure if this has any relevance to his, interest in angels. But yeah, so really, I think Levy and RIlke, they're both addressing their readers with full faith in their readers. And RIlke was, and Levy especially, they're both especially stark on these terms because in the case of Levy, he commits suicide, and he really entrusts himself to his readers, I think, with his death. And the same can be said of RIlke in this case, although he didn't commit suicide. He said at one point during his writings of the Duino Elegies, and I believe he wrote this to Lou Andreas Salome in a letter, either to Lou or to Paula or Clara, that he could die at any point and be satisfied with what he's accomplished. And that's quite the statement, really.
Yeah, Rilke's an interesting transitional figure for a lot of ways because he's a clearly modern poet. But he also, there's this late 19th century German romanticism that's kind of there and kind of also being rejected. And I find the figure of the angels in your piece really interesting. And one of the reasons why I really liked your piece is that I had to put on all my various brains except my political brain. So I had to also put on my religious scholar brain, which I don't put on that much these days. But thinking about the difference between Islamic angels and specifically Malaka Mave, which is or the angel of death. Okay. Just to speak a little bit of Hebrew poorly. Malak Malcha means like, well, angel also sometimes means king, kind of. So the angel of death is in Jewish lore associated with the devil, but again, the devil's not what the devil is in Christian theology. The devil is Ha-Satan, the accuser, and is
the
really the opponent, the accuser, the adversary. Mm-hmm. but is not really evil in the kind of almost dualistic quasi-Zoroastrian way that you have in Christian understandings of the term, because the devil's still doing God's work.
Yes. Yes. That's a really key distinction.
Right. And so the angel of death is also still doing God's work.
Yes. Yes. The angel has no will outside of God, to put it bluntly. Another, I think I might have brought up earlier, I really wished I could have gotten into some of the work that the scholar David Need has done on Rilke's later French poetry. But another source that I really wish I would have read and integrated into this essay is the Andalusian poet Federico Garcia Lorca's essays on duende. Because in that essay, he directly counters the poetic the poetic inspiration of the muse and the angel, in contrast to the Spanish concept of duende, which cannot be reduced to either angelic inspiration, which is to say revelation, or the muse, which would be to pull from Greek tradition and further on. And really, Lorca's concerned with the motivating force of death, and impermanence. Is something that I would connect Lorca to. Connecting Lorca's notion of duende to a Buddhist concept here of impermanence. And what really struck me reading Lorca, and why I would have liked to include some of his work on the duende in this essay, is because I realized immediately on reading, you can find a ready English translation of this. I have no lack of Spanish in me at all, like you might, Derick. You can find ready English translations of these essays. But the reason I'm so fascinated with this duende is because I realized immediately that Levy, is interested in the angel of death, right? So he's kind of skirting past his argument here. So really, it's another form of duende. And with Rilke also, we have to, consider that he's only speaking of angels in his work, at least primarily in the context of death. With his poem for Paula, Requiem for eine Freundin, it's a requiem. This is taking place, at a Catholic mass of mourning. And also, in the Elegies, he's invoking the angel, immediately in the context of death. On the death of who, really, of lovers, of himself, perhaps, in some ways.
Yeah, who isn't dying in the Duino Elegies? No, I love that concept and that connection, because for Rauka, in my reading, the angels are almost pure beauty, but that they have no will of their own. But their beauty encountered upon reflection of things lost, both in the Elegies and in the Requiem, and that's in the poetic form. I mean, both Elegies and Requiems, you write. I mean, I guess you can write elegies for things that aren't dead, but you usually don't. And Requiems, it's got to be, that's a death poem. It's like a tanka in Japanese. It's about something dead. That's all they're about. So I find that connection fascinating. The duende is interesting. Kind of an interesting hot topic. I don't think people would have nearly the problem finding information on Lorca's duende if they want to find it, because Tracy K. Smith did a whole book playing on it. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a poem based on it. So it's kind of in the if you're into contemporary poetic idiom, Lorca's Duende comes up a lot. Now, what it is, I have no idea exactly. I mean, like what I've gone through it, I'm like, okay, so Duende is like tragic, but it's like not the same as like bittersweet in Greek. It is also something that imparts beauty, but through some realization of negative emotion. And it's an intense emotional response. It's
to use an idiom, I would say fatal attraction captures some of it. But I think the primary distinction that Lorca is trying to make in those essays, from my recollection, is that the muse, you're being dictated something, and with the angels, you're being the action is kind of thrown upon you. But with the duende, the artist takes the motivating force within themselves and takes control of it. And that can be, the sense of the tragic, which is able, to give rise to beauty. And I think beauty is, a good point to touch on here for the elegies, because I think what you're recalling here in connection with the angels and beauty, really comes out of that first stanza of the elegies. And just like we did for the Requiem, I'd love to read my translation of that opening stanza.
Sure.
So I also have this in my essay, just like I did that excerpt of the Requiem, and this is the first stanza. And I love comparing the first stanza, especially between the many Duino translations. And I think I have the exact number in my essay, but I think it's close to 50 different translations in English now of the Duino elegies. And that is only the book itself. So, there are probably many other translations either scattered online or in excerpts to other publications. But I'll read this out because this might help ground some of our further conversation. Who, if I cried out, would alone hear me of the angels' orders? And even if one firmly held me against their heart, I would decay from their intense being. Because beauty is nothing other than the terrifying opening that we still only endure, and we so adore, because it firmly refuses to crush us. Each and every angel is terrifying. And I think that's Duende.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just reading the Stephen Mitchell out again so we can compare. And again, I really like your translation. I've actually tried to translate this poem. I don't have I probably do, but I'm not digging it up. But I think this may have been the very first RIlke poem I ever read too. So, but I'll just read the Stephen Mitchell translation. We won't go through all 50 or so that are available. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angels' hierarchies? And even if one of them pressed me suddenly against his heart, I would be consumed in that overwhelming existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are still just able to endure. And we are so odd because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Every angel is terrifying, which, you can see how this leads to the jackbooted angel image. It also can lead to like Paul Klee's famous painting of angels that Walter Benjamin was talking about.
The angel yes.
But it's another deep cut for those of you who wondered where that reference actually comes from. It's a triple reference in Benjamin. It's a Klee, but Klee's actually, I think Klee is directly responding to RIlke. I'm pretty sure that that's true.
I believe so, but I would have to confirm that also. And I just want to really quickly, say, if that's the only one that we want to read as a comparison, I also want to say, and I can't remember the translator. I really wish I could, but I think the first translation of the Elegies that I read, other than the Mitchell, had that last line saying that every angel is terrible.
Oh yeah, no, I have it. This is another common one. This is I'll read one more. This is by Robert Hunter. This one is formatted very differently and breaks the lines very differently. Who, though cry loud, would hear me in the angel's orders. By the way, that was now 2 lines, not 1. And should my plea ascend, were I gathered to the glory of some incandescent heart, my own faint flame of being would fail for the glare. Beauty is as close to terror as we can endure. Angels would not condescend to damn our meager souls. I don't even know where that's coming from. This is why they awe and why they terrify us so. Every angel is terrible.
There we go.
Which I'm just like, those are some choices. And I don't want to get into theory of translation here. I actually think these are both valid translations, but one is doing a whole lot more legwork for the reader than the other. And adding a bunch of stuff that I don't remember being in the German. But that's even true though for Mitchell, in that, like I was mentioning, Mitchell really likes using linking words for some fucking reasons that I don't understand.
Right, a lot of the punctuation is changed for no reason really, and that really confuses me, to be honest. Because punctuation, it's kind of like a mathematical language in a way,
and English and German punctuation are not that terribly different.
No, so. I mean, we gain most of our punctuation, from German in a lot of ways. Although it really is interesting, the how the use of em dashes has increased, over the last half century or more in English, usage. Although I couldn't really say much about the history of punctuation in English. That's just how it seems to me. But yeah, no, thank you for reading that, because I had forgotten the translator in that line. Robert Hunter.
The angel. That every angel is terrible is like, well, I mean, I think that's technically correct, but that's not really what that means.
No, it just sounds like something. A child would scream out, like, at the end of a Catholic mass. I don't know.
Every angel is terrible, but yeah.
So we could skirt by, some, the theory of translation, but one thing I really would like to bring out on this point is that I'm drawing primarily from Pierre Jaurès and the Swedish translator Johannes Göransson, who also edits for the wonderful publishing house Action Books, that does a lot of translation work. And one thing I'd like to mention about that is that I'm drawing from Jaurès' translations of Paul Celan's later work. He's gone on to do more of Celan's work, but that's something that I begin the essay with. And with Göransson, he recently translated this poem. I believe it's something about a green angel. Also, it's about an angel. But with their theories, their theories are not really their theories, because they both don't really elaborate, anything close to like an analytical framework for translation. But both of their approaches stem out of their own translation work and their own approach to their own literary production, because they're both poets also. Jaurès has a lovely book I'll just mention briefly called Fox Trails and Trots. And Göransson, one book I mentioned in the essay is like a colonial pageant, I believe. And both of their translations, the style of them at least, really resemble a lot of their own literary work. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me because they're both, poets who don't come, English is not their mother tongue. For Göransson, it's Swedish, and for Juris, it's, I believe, I know, German, but also I can't quite remember. I did read a book of his biography once. So apologies on that. I can't quite recall.
Well, he was born in Luxembourg, and I'm trying to remember what all they speak in Luxembourg. So
yeah, I'd imagine it's quite a lot of languages, really. But anyways, both of their approaches really overlap, and that's something that fascinated me because, as far as I know, they aren't, in direct communication, or at least they haven't done any projects together, as far as I'm aware. But both of them approach translation as really the basis of all literature. Like, for them, translation isn't just this auxiliary task of literature, but it really provides the basis for doing literature itself. Because writing literature itself for them is an act of translation. The act of translation is also the result of translation. The translation, whether that be of thoughts or images into words, or experiences into language. I'm reminded of, I believe, the French poet's remark to Degas on him not being able to write poetry. And I believe this is, I don't quite know the pronunciation, Mallarmé. I know he's a French poet, but he says, you don't write in images or thoughts, you write in words. And I think, that's significant because when we're doing translation work, we're producing something. You're not just, shifting some words over, into another completely separate field of speech. All languages are connected to each other, and every language has its own modes of expression, and that entails a transformation. And so both Juris and Göransson agree on this point, that every translation cannot be based on equivalence or accuracy, like we were talking about earlier, Derick. But every translation is a transformation, and also, necessarily, perhaps, a self-transformation. And that's something I've experienced myself in doing a lot of translation work, is that it definitely impacts, how I write myself, getting deeply involved with another person's writing. As I think we all do in the process of just reading other people, we take up their expressions constantly.
Yeah, it's actually, you even take up discourse patterns. Like when I lived in Mexico, I'd find myself like doing a lot of translation of like Mexican and other Latin poetry, just for myself. I wasn't like doing it to publish. I was just trying to make sure that I understood what the hell I was reading. And it amazes me how even the syntax and grammar and rhythms of these languages will get in your head. And it's not new. I mean, like even like English Renaissance poetry is highly based on the rhythms that come out of Italian Renaissance poetry, etc., etc. But it does really affect you. And if you're a person who's operating in multiple languages, particularly if you're operating in multiple languages where you use them all the time, you will start creating a patois in your head. And I think that that's unavoidable. And with someone like Levy, for example, there's so many different influences going in there. I mean, there's several different languages. There's many different cultures.
Yeah,
And that's true for, go ahead.
Cleveland, is just a massive hub of ethnicities. A lot of immigrants, especially, not just early on with North American travel from the East Coast, but also Irish and German, and then from Eastern Europe primarily, which is where my family, who moved to Cleveland in the early 1800s, is from. Czechoslovakia and Hungary in particular. So yeah, I mean, Cleveland, there's a lot of speaking influences that are going on across the different neighborhoods. And yeah, Levy has an immense amount of literary influences that may not at all be obvious because of the way he writes in such a simple address. And he gets caught up in this sort of scholarly tendency to include him in beat poetry, which makes a lot of sense on the surface level. But actually a lot of his direct literary influences that I've noted coming out, studying his biography, are a lot of local poets and artists, including the late Russell Atkins, who helped edit along with Adelaide Simon the Freelance magazine, and Kenneth Patchen was another major influence, an Ohio poet who later moved to California. As well as, earlier on, I think, there's no direct biographical connection here, but the Ohio poet, Cleveland poet Hart Crane, who did begin writing the bridge here in Cleveland, although a lot of writing tends to connect that with New York for obvious reasons of the Brooklyn Bridge. But it was actually written here in Cleveland, fascinatingly. Not that Cleveland needs that. But it might.
Well, Levy's interesting for a variety of reasons to me in this way, and for those of you who aren't as familiar with poetry, you're just gonna have to deal with what I'm about to say. But Levy's associated with the beats, I think, mostly because of the Buddhism and the direct address, but his actual connections in Cleveland, like Russell Atkins, actually make him kind of a bridge between these West Coast poets and the New York school. And he seems to be more related to the New York school. And people expect...
He did hitchhike to New York. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but people, I mean, to say this, people expect the New York school to be influenced by all over. For some reason, the beats are... I don't know. I mean, the beats are interesting also... I'm going to say something somewhat controversial. My favorite beat poets are like Rexroth and Snyder, not Kerouac and Ginsberg. But Kerouac and Ginsberg are pop culture figures. And that's why, like, you discover the beats like you discover Paul Sartre when you're in high school. At least, when I was in high school in the 90s. Like, it's
and you're not reading Critique of Dialectical Reason or, Saint Genet or the book on Flaubert, and all that. You're reading, Nausea.
You're reading Nausea. In fact, that's all you're reading is Nausea. Then you're going to jump to Camus, and then you're going to realize, oh, Sartre is actually interesting as a scholar, like when you're in your 30s, because all of a sudden you're like, all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, there's a lot more here than what I thought from reading Nausea. But go ahead.
Oh, I would say, out of some of the beat figures, I would connect, I would say Rexroth and Snyder. Levy was, interested in Snyder. He did dedicate, I believe, a poem to him, based off of the Cold Mountain poems. But Levy did have actual connections with Diane de Prima and Ed Sanders.
I was about to say Diane de Prima was who I was thinking of. So go
yes,
ahead.
He published one of Ed Sanders' first books of poetry, King, Lord, Queen, Freak, I believe. There are not many copies of it. I have never actually read a copy of it. Hopefully I'll get the chance eventually, because it's just a great title. And he did publish one of the revolutionary letters of Diane de Prima's before that was published as a collection in one of his periodicals, because Levy didn't only publish books through his presses. First one was Renegade, which was primarily letterpress and printed in the basement of his cousin's house here in Cleveland. But the second press being Seven Flowers, which was mainly mimeograph, and the latter being a lot of newsprint work. But he also did, besides the book projects, were a few different periodicals and journals, the first of which being the Silver Cesspool, which is kind of a play on Lake Erie, being extremely polluted as it was and continues to be, but far
kind of
less
still
so.
is.
It's swimmable now. I would say, during I love this anecdote. During Levy's time here, and specifically under the mayorship of the first, I believe, first African American mayor of a major metropolitan area, Carl Stokes, in the 60s here, he sectioned off part of Edgewater Beach here in Cleveland and had it highly chlorinated so that it was safely swimmable, while the rest of the lake was unswimmable. And this was part of his campaign for a cleaner Cleveland. Nowadays you can swim in Lake Erie, but it's still not, the best. But anyways, so he ran Silver Cesspool, which was mainly haiku actually, and a lot of inking, he did some prints. Levy was also a collagist and a printmaker as well. The second periodical being what he's primarily known for, and I think this might be why he's so primarily associated with the Beats, because of his advocacy for the legalization of drugs, but particularly marijuana. This periodical was called the Marijuana Quarterly, and I've seen this reprinted, as the standard spelling of marijuana, but it was marijuana with two N's and an AH, like marijuana. And the third, which has a really fascinating title, the Buddhist Third Class Junk Mail Oracle. And it was in that latter publication, I believe, that Levy published one of de Prima's revolutionary letters. So he does have those connections with figures of the beat in New York, but not much so, with Ginsberg or Kerouac or a lot of the other figures. Perhaps also we could throw in Gregory Corso, which had ties with the Chicago poet and publisher Douglas Blazek, who published one of Levy's books, which was called Cleveland, The Rectal Eye Visions, quite late on in his life. But I'm kind of losing the thread here, but those are some of the actual connections in Levy's life between some people that we might associate with beat poetry, which really I think is kind of an illusion, really created by Ginsberg in a way, kind of stringing together a lot of these people under a convenient label. And Kerouac himself, who created the term, would later go on to dispute his own connections to it and try to redefine it as well.
Yeah, I actually was recently watching Kerouac's conservative Catholic interviews with William Buckley on Crossfire, where he's railing against the other beats. And Kerouac kind of dies a bitter man and also a rabid alcoholic. And I find that very different compared to someone like de Prima. One, we don't talk a lot about the female beats. There were several, de Prima and Ann Waldman being.
Ann Waldman, who also went on to help direct the Naropa Poetic Center with Ginsberg.
Yep. Met her at the same time I met Pierre Jaris, actually, again
Oh,
in New Orleans. But had a lot of sketchy literary adventures in New Orleans. But I find this kind of interesting to tie this back to this early 20th century German poetics, and also the French poetics. I mean, you do like I do think with Levy, Mallarmé, René Char,
mhm.
the French symbolists and surrealist poets, they actually are a major influence.
Yeah, and I think we also do need to mention people like Jean Cocteau also
Mhm.
was a direct influence on Levy, and there's probably quite a few others that are escaping me right now. Um, I probably wouldn't go so far as to mention like Valerie or something like that, because I'm kind of I was kind of speculating today, reading his book, Charms, whether one of Levy's books is drawing from that, which is called Tombstone for a Lonely, as a Lonely Charm, something, a 3-book length project that he published with another local poet here who later moved to California, D.R. Wagner, who was also unfortunately recently passed away. But that's another thing I hope to, I hope to focus on here is just, that a lot of, the poetry that has been happening here in Cleveland, it can be really, I think tempting to look at literary history and scan it, even internationally as we're doing, Derick, and consider, with Levy, what some of his influences may have been from some of these larger figures. But the really difficult work when doing a biography, and this is why I think biographical research is really necessary in the case with Levy and a lot of poets, really, is because there's a lot of lesser known figures that are not written about, that books were published in small editions, but that were very important figures in their lives, especially, in their local milieu, their local scene. And, a lot of people for Levy, remain, fairly, if not unnamed, then certainly they're not approached with the same analysis that we bring to Rilke and other, figures that we call major poets, not minor poets, or
Right.
minor literatures, for example, as a term. And so that's, I think I'm falling into that tendency here with this essay, in, looking, at Levy alongside of Rilke and Celan, who are, of course, some of the most widely read German poets in English today, if not the most widely read German
This
poets.
is probably the most right. I mean, like, um, even though in Germany, I would say Holderlin and Goethe and a lot of their predecessors are more important. In
Mhm.
English, not a whole lot of people read Faust. I mean, I did in college, but I think
That was
I don't think.
close to it.
But I don't think it's common anymore. And not a whole lot of people read anything by Holderlin. Usually, when that gets brought up, it's actually usually in a philosophical context or something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And D.A. Levy's fascinating for me because, I mean, in my head, he falls into this weird category that people have accused Ezra Pound of being, which is a major minor poet. And I don't like the distinction between major and minor poets as a minor poet myself. But also, Levy's really influential in a very specific sphere of influence. But for a
As a publisher.
long,
Yeah.
yeah, but for a long time, you could only get him in 2 books that I knew of that you could find. And that
Mhm.
was his reprints in the Outlaw Bible of American Poetry, which saved a lot of people, if we're quite honest, from utter oblivion. And then
Sure.
I told you I found a version of the Buddhist third class junk mail oracle The
By
Art
Mike
and
Golden.
Poetry of D.A. Levy
Mike
in
Golden.
by Mike Golden, which has a bunch of Levy poetry in it. But I found it, and it was from another poet's collection, and I
Yes.
bought it because it had a weird title. Like that's how
That's the periodical.
became
yeah.
When I was looking at your first press stuff, I was like, oh, you're into D.A. Levy. There's only like 5 people I know who don't live in Cleveland, although you do, so I guess you count in the Cleveland contingent, who really are into D.A. Levy, right? Like, but it does seem like there's been a renaissance in like Levy scholarship. At the same time, one of the reasons why I want to do these poetry shows, even though they can be arcane to people, and even the most widely read German poets in English, RIlke and Celan, are arcane to a lot of people, is that even fairly educated people now are intimidated by poetry. And I mean, I don't get that, but people are like, oh, I don't understand poems. And I'm like, you read Hegel. How is how is Rilke difficult when you're reading Hegel?
Fair point.
But I do think getting back into this world for a lot of people would be fine. And Levy, I think the thing with Levy is that we've talked about this beat element of it. The other thing with Levy is he constantly got in trouble for obscenity trials, like almost, like a Lenny Bruce as much as anything else. I mean, so if you're a prurient teenager, do those still exist? I don't know. Teenagers today, I teach them and see them every day. I don't know if they have those kind of interests anymore. Maybe the internet has killed all joy in their lives, but it does seem like Levy's an interesting poet in that they can seem really simple, they can seem even crude, and then the more you read them, the more you find there, the more richness there is, and more you see these layers and layers of meaning. And it's hard for me to even compare him to other poets in that way, particularly poets in English.
Yes, and I think that's because, and again here, this is a comparison that perhaps because it's almost, I'm so close to the material, I had completely forgotten, but the obvious comparison to make is that all of these poets are writing in long, lengthy forms. With Celan, it is in the song cycle form, although it's, written in very punchy, short episodes, his books are really lengthy, especially when Derick compiles them together. The last 4 or 5 books of his later work, from Atemwende on to Sprachschluf, or I might be mistaken there with the last one. But and with Rilke, with the Elegies, there are 10 elegies in the Duino Elegies, each of them being anywhere from 3 to 5 or more pages in length, depending on how it's printed. And a lot of his other work, being in the form of a long poem. And you mentioned the books that you came across with with Levy's material, and unfortunately, those are probably instances where Levy has been kind of torn apart out of his context. Some of the shorter poems are presented, possibly maybe one of the larger poems or an excerpt of it, but the way Levy was published during his lifetime was as a book length. Was in book length format. These weren't collections. They were primarily almost all long poems, and anywhere from 10 to 30 pages in length, like the Suburban Monastery Death poem from 1968. So there's difficulty when approaching long poems, or as Octavio Paz would say, the extended poem, which I prefer. And, when you get into a long poem, and then especially when you're looking at, the potential relationship between, many different long poems in a poet's, work, the difficulties really just multiply. Because, Celan and RIlke and Levy, they're working, with a lot of intertextuality and intratextuality And this gets especially difficult because a lot of Levy's work isn't just working with literary references, but it's a really highly geographical poetry, and not just a geographical poetry across Ohio, as some of Kenneth Patchen's work is or Hart Crane's work is, but also locally and here in Cleveland, particularly in his poem Cleveland Under Covers. He's naming streets throughout the poem consistently, and specifically discussing what is on that street, and kind of approaching streets, as he says in that poem, as magical names, and this is where the conversation could shift into what is called concrete poetry or visual poetry, which has been the primary focus of scholarly research into Levy's work, which I don't think, I'm not taking issue with that. But I would say that it might be a shame or at least an unfortunate circumstance because Levy did produce so much lexical work. And so I think, by getting into Levy's work as a translator through RIlke and Celan, I was able to, hone in more on the lexical aspect of his work, which I think has been neglected because of everybody's, interest in his visual work as a collagist or with his typewriter poetry, which, is primarily, shown in a lot of the periodical work, and some of his later work, such as the Tibetan stroboscope or the Egyptian stroboscope, which was a collaborative project with D.R. Wagner. Again, I think I've lost the thread here, but so maybe you can hone in on some of this if you picked up anything.
Well, one thing I would tell people to do is I do think the lexical is interesting in D.A. Levy, and unfortunately, he is sort of presented as either a beat or concrete poet, or kind of poet art collagist. I would think that I would tell people to read your essay to talk about the way mythology and the way that informs the images and the collages and these layers of textuality. I would also tell people that I know the way we talk about this makes these poems sound incredibly difficult. And in some ways they are. But I also want to say I got into RIlke just playing around the Barnes and Nobles in a sales rack, as a teenager. So, and maybe it was because I didn't have the pressure or the shame of being particularly worried about having it make sense that I fell in love with it because it was so bizarre to me, and that actually attracted me to it. Levy is similar because I saw Levy. I mean, you're right. The Matt Golden book is not always a great representation, and I would also add that it is part of this way that you kind of can see him as like this countercultural beat figure because the
Exactly.
Golden speculative essay definitely weighs into that.
Yeah, that essay is a real shame because it is pretty much the main reference point for a lot of people, and I would point people if they're looking for a somewhat accessible book on Levy, I would point people to the Ingrid Swanberg edited edition from Ghost Pony Press, which is out of print, but there should be available copies online being sold used, which is called Concrete and Etc., which does present a fair amount of his concrete and visual work, but it also does present some full-length books of his lexical work. So I find it to be a pretty balanced anthology, along with some biographical points of interest that follow the anthology. And I am actually in the process right now of putting together republications of all of Levy's work for an event I have here. So I have some available through Between the Highway Press right now for free. and I continue to make them free, but I'm redesigning all of them because currently I just have them as excerpts, but I'm fully redesigning a lot of work that hasn't actually been republished since it was published in the 60s. And so that's an ongoing project of mine. And people can find that, on the press website, hopefully, by this summer. Yeah.
All right. So, Alexander, what press do you work for? I know, but they don't. And I'm also going to drop people. I would actually, when people ask me what Paul Celan they should read, I actually suggest Pierre Jaurès anyway. Those are
it's
my
a hefty volume, but it's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, that is. There's the early ones, which is Memory Rose into Threshold of Speech, and then the later ones, the later books, which is Breath Turn into the Timestead. And they're not super cheap because they're huge.
It's a real day stopper, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, you can use them as weapons if you don't like them.
That's great. I always used to tell my friends, this is the book that holds up all my other books at the end of the top of my shelf. Paul, everything rests on Paul Celan, really, so it doesn't fall over.
Right. So, but where can people find your work, your press's work, and all that, Alex?
Sure. So people can find the press. It's Between the Highway. The website would be betweenthehighway.org. Thank you, Derick. I have this essay that was put up by Rob McLennan of Above Ground Press. This is through his online journal, Periodicities. He publishes quite a bit of material on there all the time. It's in this lovely old blog format, that a lot of presses don't use anymore, but he still does. Besides that, I would tell people to look out for this summer for the republications of Levy's work. And I also publish new authors every summer. Besides that, working on the biography, and that could be a decade-long project, as these kind of projects go, Varn. I know you're working on something with Christopher Lash. And
which is now we're half decade in, and I have written all of 2 chapters. So the problem when you're writing something even exegetical, I'm not writing a true biography, but it's I now have to do archive work, and I have to literally read everything and in multiple drafts so that I don't say something stupid.
Yes. And archival work, it's a very long process. It entails travel usually. Luckily here, a lot of the archives for Levy are here in Cleveland. That's
you are lucky enough that they archived Levy too. I was actually happy to hear that because some of these poets, I have found poets in some of these collections, like Poems from the Millennium or the Outlaw Bibles, that it's really, really hard to find any of their work even in archival form.
Yes.
It's just we got 5 poems. There's probably 100 more somewhere, but we don't know where they're at.
Yeah, and oftentimes, people's work like that just does not get included in archives because it's either destroyed, moving apartments, getting kicked out of apartments, or their family, takes over the materials, throws it away. That happened in the case of a lot of local poets here that I've just started to get research on, trying to get correspondence from people. You realize their work was never archived. It was thrown out, by their family members.
Yeah.
And I think that's.
Yeah, it's often tragic. As a person who is mixed on whether I want anyone to have any of the other books that I haven't published, which I have about 5 of them that I have just sit and look at and think about, I should probably revise this and publish it one day. And then the other parts of me is or I should burn it.